However, when we examine the historical record with cold, dispassionate analysis and look at the actual statistics and outcomes of these missions, a very different picture emerges. The reality of kamikaze warfare was far removed from the mythology that has grown up around it. The truth, documented in military records, survivor accounts, and careful historical analysis, reveals that the vast majority of these suicide missions never achieved their objectives. Most kamikaze pilots never even managed to get close enough to an American ship to attempt an attack, let alone successfully strike one. The brutal mathematics of aerial warfare, combined with American technological superiority, superior training, and overwhelming defensive capabilities, meant that almost every single kamikaze attempt ended not in a spectacular explosion against an enemy vessel, but in a lonely death far from the target, with the pilot's sacrifice achieving absolutely nothing in strategic terms. To understand how this came to be, we need to look at the context in which Japan launched its organized kamikaze campaign. The first coordinated kamikaze operations began in the final months of 1944 during the massive naval engagement known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which took place in the waters around the Philippines. By this point in the war, Japan's situation had deteriorated to a catastrophic degree. Their once mighty Imperial Japanese Navy, which had struck Pearl Harbor with such devastating effect just 3 years earlier and had dominated the early months of the Pacific War, was now little more than a shadow of its former self. Years of attrition warfare had taken an enormous toll. The Battle of Midway in 1942 had destroyed 4 of Japan's fleet carriers and killed many of their most experienced pilots. The naval battles around Guadalcanal had consumed more ships and more men. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, mockingly called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots, had seen Japanese naval aviation virtually annihilated. By late 1944, Japan's navy existed more on paper than in reality, with most of its major surface combatants either resting on the ocean floor or trapped in harbours without fuel to sortie. The pilot situation was even more dire. In the early years of the war, Japanese naval aviators had been among the finest in the world, rigorously trained over years in demanding programs that produced skilled, experienced pilots capable of incredible feats. But warfare is a grinding process of attrition, and each battle consumed more of these irreplaceable men. Unlike the Americans, who had established extensive training programs back home that could produce thousands of new pilots every year, Japan lacked the resources, the infrastructure, and increasingly the time to properly train replacement aircrew. The veterans who had attacked Pearl Harbor, who had fought over China, who had honed their skills over years of service, were gone, killed in the skies over the Pacific, or lost in the depths of the ocean when their carriers went down. The men replacing them were rushed through abbreviated training programs, sometimes receiving only a few weeks of instruction when they needed months or years to develop real competence. Many of these replacement pilots had barely mastered the basics of aviation, struggling with fundamental skills like navigation, formation flying, and even basic takeoffs and landings. The fuel situation compounded everything. Japan's access to petroleum had been one of the primary reasons it had gone to war in the first place, and by late 1944, the American submarine campaign had strangled Japan's oil supplies. Tankers bringing crude from the Dutch East Indies were being torpedoed faster than they could be replaced. Refineries were being bombed. The precious aviation gasoline needed to keep planes in the air was becoming increasingly scarce. This meant that training flights had to be cut back, that pilots received even less practice time than the already inadequate training programs allowed. It meant that operational missions had to be carefully rationed. Every drop of fuel became precious beyond measure. Into this desperate situation came the concept of the kamikaze attack. On paper, from a purely theoretical standpoint, the idea had a certain terrible logic. If you couldn't afford to train pilots properly, if you couldn't afford the fuel for extended engagements, if your aircraft were becoming obsolete compared to American models, why not turn each plane into a guided missile? A Zero fighter, loaded with 500 pounds of high explosives and diving at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour, carried tremendous kinetic and explosive energy. If such an aircraft could strike a destroyer squarely, the results would be devastating. The plane would penetrate the ship's relatively thin deck armor, and the explosives would detonate inside the vessel, starting fires, rupturing fuel tanks, and potentially causing ammunition magazines to explode. Even larger ships like cruisers and carriers could potentially be crippled by such an attack. The kamikaze concept eliminated the need for the pilot to successfully deliver a bomb or torpedo and then escape, which required significant skill and experience. It reduced the mission to its simplest possible form: just hit the target. Any pilot who could keep his plane in the air and pointed in the right direction could theoretically be a kamikaze. But reality proved merciless in exposing the flaws in this desperate strategy. Let's start with the raw numbers, because they tell a story that propaganda could never admit. Over the course of the war, from late 1944 until Japan's surrender in August 1945, approximately 3,800 kamikaze pilots died in these suicide missions. Think about that number for a moment. 3,800 young men, each of them someone's son or brother or friend, each of them a person with dreams and fears and hopes for the future, all of them ordered to die. On the other side of the equation, these attacks managed to damage or sink roughly 400 Allied ships, a number that sounds significant until you examine it more closely. These attacks also killed approximately 4,900 Allied sailors, another terrible toll of human life. On the surface, if you don't think too deeply about it, these numbers might seem to justify the Japanese command's decision. 400 ships damaged or sunk sounds like it would have had a serious impact on American naval operations. 4,900 enemy casualties sounds meaningful. But we need to put these numbers in proper context to understand their true significance. By 1945, the United States Navy had grown into the most powerful naval force in human history, a staggering armada that dwarfed anything the world had ever seen. The US operated over 1,200 major warships, not counting the thousands upon thousands of smaller vessels like patrol craft, landing ships, supply vessels, and auxiliaries that kept the fleet supplied and operational. The industrial might of America had been turned fully toward war production, and shipyards up and down both coasts were launching new vessels at an astounding rate. When you do the mathematics, you realize that fewer than 4% of American major naval vessels were either sunk or disabled by kamikaze attacks. 4%. That means 96% of the US fleet was completely unaffected by the entire kamikaze campaign. For all the terror these attacks inspired, for all the lives lost on both sides, the strategic impact was negligible. The American naval advance toward Japan continued almost without pause. Every island that the United States wanted to take, they took. Every landing they planned, they executed. The kamikaze attacks bloodied them, certainly, caused casualties and created fear and made men flinch at the sound of air raid sirens, but they did not and could not stop the inexorable American advance. The exchange ratio was even more damning. For every kamikaze pilot who died, they killed on average barely more than one American sailor. Think about what that means from a strategic standpoint. Japan was desperately short of men, of pilots, of anyone with any kind of technical training. The United States had a population more than twice the size of Japan's and an industrial base that could replace losses far more easily. Trading one highly trained person, someone who had received months of education and represented a significant investment of resources, for one enemy casualty was an absolutely terrible exchange rate by any military calculation. If Japan had been able to achieve a ratio where each kamikaze killed even 10 or 20 enemy sailors, the mathematics might have worked out differently. But 1 for 1, or in many cases worse than 1 for 1 when you count all the pilots who died without hitting anything, was simply catastrophic from Japan's perspective. The first fundamental weakness in the kamikaze strategy was the abysmal quality of pilot training by the time these attacks began in earnest. This cannot be overstated as a factor in their failure rate. Earlier in the war, in 1941 and 1942, Japanese naval aviators had been extraordinarily skilled. Their training had been rigorous and extensive. Pilots spent years learning their craft, practicing navigation over open ocean, mastering formation flying, learning to land on carrier decks in various weather conditions, and developing the complex skills needed for air combat and attacking surface vessels. These men had been formidable opponents. American pilots in the early months of the war had learned to respect the skill of their Japanese adversaries, even as they fought them. But by late 1944, those veterans were virtually all dead or invalided out of service. The men replacing them rushed through abbreviated training courses as Japan grew more desperate, simply lacked the fundamental skills needed to be effective combat pilots. Many of these replacement pilots had received only a few weeks in flight school, barely enough time to learn to take off, fly straight and level, and land without crashing. Advanced techniques like navigation over water, where there are no landmarks to guide you and you must rely on dead reckoning and instruments, were skills they had never properly developed. Some pilots couldn't even take off properly without assistance, wobbling down runways and barely getting airborne. Landing was even more dangerous, with crashes being depressingly common. And these were the men being asked to conduct one of the most difficult missions imaginable. Finding a specific target in the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean, evading enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire, and then intentionally crashing their aircraft into a moving ship with enough precision to actually hit it. The task was beyond the abilities of most of these poorly trained aviators. American technology provided another massive advantage that the kamikaze strategy could not overcome. By late 1944, American ships were equipped with increasingly sophisticated radar systems that could detect incoming aircraft from dozens of miles away. This early warning meant that American combat air patrols could be vectored toward incoming raids long before they reached the fleet. Fighter directors aboard ships would watch the radar screens, see the blips representing Japanese aircraft, and radio instructions to the American fighters circling overhead or nearby, guiding them precisely to intercept the threat. This removed the element of surprise that kamikaze attacks needed to succeed. Instead of catching the Americans off guard, kamikaze formations often found themselves jumped by American fighters while they were still many miles from their targets. One American sailor, interviewed years after the war, described watching kamikaze formations being torn apart by American fighter patrols, seeing the Japanese planes falling from the sky in flames miles and miles from the fleet, never getting anywhere close to attempting an attack. The flaming wrecks would spiral down into the ocean, taking their pilots to anonymous graves far from any witness, their sacrifices achieving nothing. The second major weakness was the lack of coordination in kamikaze attacks. The original plan had called for these suicide missions to be launched in massive waves, with dozens or even hundreds of aircraft arriving simultaneously to overwhelm American defenses. The theory was sound enough. If you sent enough planes at once, even if most were shot down, some would inevitably get through simply by saturating the defensive fire. But theory and practice diverged sharply. Japan's fuel shortages meant that large formations were difficult to assemble. Different groups would take off at different times based on when they could get fuel. The inexperience of the pilots meant that formations would fall apart en route to the target. Navigation errors would scatter groups across hundreds of miles of ocean. Communication failures meant that different units often didn't know where other units were or when they were attacking. The result was that instead of facing overwhelming waves of dozens of aircraft at once, American ships more often encountered lone planes or small groups of 2 or 3 aircraft attempting attacks. A single kamikaze diving at an entire task force, with its combat air patrol of dozens of fighters and its wall of anti-aircraft fire from multiple ships, stood virtually no chance of success. American fighter pilots racked up kill after kill, reporting that whole squadrons of kamikazes were falling to their guns in a matter of minutes. The Japanese planes were often flying straight and level, easy targets for experienced American pilots in superior aircraft like the Grumman F-6F Hellcat and the Chance Vought F-4U Corsair. Then there was the sheer weight of American anti-aircraft defences, which by 1945 had reached a level of sophistication and density that made approaching a US fleet an almost suicidal proposition even without the kamikaze's intent to crash. American warships bristled with weapons specifically designed to knock aircraft from the sky. The 40mm Bofors guns were rapid-firing, radar-directed weapons that could throw up a wall of explosive shells. The 20mm Oerlikon autocannons could track fast-moving targets and fill the sky with tracers. The 5-inch dual-purpose guns, originally designed to fight other ships, had been fitted with special fuses and could engage aerial targets effectively. Most devastating of all were the proximity-fused shells that the Americans had developed, a technological marvel that changed anti-aircraft warfare fundamentally. These shells contained miniature radar sets that would detect when the shell was near an aircraft and automatically detonate, sending fragments in all directions. This meant gunners no longer needed direct hits to knock down planes. Getting close was good enough. The proximity fuse multiplied the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire enormously. The Battle of Okinawa provides the clearest statistical picture of just how ineffective kamikaze tactics actually were when faced with this level of defense. Okinawa was one of the last major battles of the Pacific War, taking place from April to June 1945, and it saw some of the most intense kamikaze activity of the entire war. Japan threw everything they had left at the American fleet supporting the invasion, launching wave after wave of suicide attacks in a desperate attempt to drive the Americans away from this island that was practically on Japan's doorstep. The statistics from this battle are stark and revealing. American ships at Okinawa fired nearly 500,000 anti-aircraft shells at incoming kamikazes over the course of the battle. 500,000 shells. The sky over the American fleet would light up like a deadly fireworks display when kamikazes approached, with tracers crisscrossing in every direction and explosions creating a nearly impenetrable barrier of steel and fire. Against this defensive gauntlet, Japan launched approximately 1,900 kamikaze sorties at Okinawa. 1,900 young men took off intending to die. And how many actually managed to strike an American ship? Fewer than 15%. Let that sink in for a moment. Of every 100 kamikaze pilots who took off during the Okinawa campaign, 85 or more of them died without accomplishing anything. They were either shot down by American fighters before reaching the fleet, blown out of the sky by anti-aircraft fire, or they missed their targets and crashed harmlessly into the ocean. More than 1,600 pilots at Okinawa alone died without striking anything at all. Imagine the waste represented by those numbers. Think about it in human terms first. 1,600 young men who died for nothing, whose families received news that their sons had sacrificed themselves heroically for the emperor and the homeland, but whose deaths achieved absolutely no military purpose whatsoever. Then think about it in terms of resources. Hundreds of aircraft destroyed, each one representing precious aluminum, steel, rubber and other materials that Japan could barely afford to spare. Barrels and barrels of aviation fuel consumed, fuel that Japan could not replace, burned up in missions that failed. The time and effort of mechanics and ground crews, the use of airfields, the expenditure of ammunition for the guns mounted on the planes, all of it wasted. And for what? For results that barely slowed the American advance at all. Even in the cases where kamikaze pilots did manage to hit their targets, the damage inflicted was often far from the devastating blows that had been promised. American warships, particularly the larger vessels like battleships and aircraft carriers, were built with massive armor protection and had extensive damage control systems specifically designed to keep ships fighting even after taking serious hits. The crews were drilled endlessly in damage control procedures, knowing exactly what to do when fire broke out or when compartments flooded. They knew how to isolate damaged sections, how to fight fires, how to shore up bulkheads, how to keep ships afloat and operational even after terrible punishment. The USS Bunker Hill provides a perfect example of American resilience and damage control excellence in action. This aircraft carrier was struck by 2 kamikaze aircraft in quick succession, a nightmare scenario that resulted in massive fires and explosions across the flight deck and in the hangar spaces below. Nearly 400 American sailors and Marines died in the attack, a terrible loss of life. The ship was badly damaged, with fires raging and parts of the flight deck torn apart. But within months, the Bunker Hill was back in action, repaired and refitted, ready to resume operations. This was typical of American damage control capabilities. Ships that would have been complete losses for Japan's navy, which lacked the repair facilities and resources to fix such damage, were patched up and returned to service by American repair crews. Destroyers and smaller ships, which lacked the heavy armor of battleships and carriers, certainly suffered worse when struck by kamikazes. These vessels could be crippled or sunk by a direct hit. But even here, the overall strategic picture remained unchanged. The United States had built so many destroyers and destroyer escorts that losing even dozens of them, while tragic for the crews involved, did not meaningfully impact the fleet's operational capability. For every destroyer sunk, there were dozens more ready to take its place. The American fleet as a whole just kept moving forward, kept supporting landing operations, kept bombarding Japanese positions, kept launching airstrikes, kept tightening the noose around Japan. Kamikazes could bloody the US Navy, could cause casualties and damage, could make individual battles more costly, but they could not and did not stop it. They could not reverse the strategic situation. They could not force the Americans to alter their plans. They could not save Japan from defeat. The human tragedy underlying the entire kamikaze campaign is something that often gets overlooked in discussions focused purely on tactics and statistics, but it deserves serious consideration. The vast majority of kamikaze pilots were teenagers or men in their very early 20s, young men who should have been starting their adult lives, thinking about careers and families and futures. Instead, they were being sent to certain death. Many of these young men never truly believed in the mission they had been given. Survivors of the kamikaze program, men who were training as kamikaze pilots but never flew missions because the war ended, have spoken in later years about the psychological pressure they faced. They described being coerced, being pressured by commanders and by social expectations to volunteer for suicide missions. The word volunteer is almost meaningless in such a context. When your commanding officer asks who will step forward to die for the emperor, when everyone around you is watching, when you know that refusing will mark you as a coward and bring shame on your family, is that really volunteering? Some of these young men wrote farewell letters to their families that have survived, letters that reveal men who were terrified, who did not want to die, who in some cases confessed in writing that they hoped their planes would malfunction so they would have an excuse to turn back and survive. Others never even made it to the battle. Their inexperience killed them before they could attempt their missions. Records show numerous instances of kamikaze pilots crashing on takeoff, losing control shortly after getting airborne, flying into mountains or the ocean because they couldn't navigate properly, or suffering mechanical failures they lacked the skill to handle. They died in accidents before ever reaching the sea, killed by their lack of training rather than by American guns. The propaganda painted them as divine warriors, as noble heroes willingly sacrificing themselves in a blaze of glory for a sacred cause. The reality was boys, many of them just boys, sent to die in obsolete machines that were outmatched by superior American technology and training. They were sacrificed not because their deaths served any rational military purpose by that late stage of the war, but because the Japanese command structure could not or would not admit defeat and seek peace. One captured Japanese officer, interrogated by American intelligence after the war ended, admitted something that cuts to the heart of the kamikaze tragedy. He said, and this is paraphrased from the interrogation records, that Japan did not have enough bombs anymore, did not have enough ships, did not have enough men left to fight, so the command had chosen to throw away the last thing they had, their youth. They sent their children to die because they had nothing else left to send. The statement is brutally honest and reveals the bankruptcy of the strategy. By 1945, Japan had already lost the war. Any competent strategic analysis made this clear. The United States had overwhelming advantages in every category: industrial production, technological sophistication, trained manpower, resources, access to fuel and raw materials, everything that matters in modern warfare. Japan could not possibly win. The most they could have hoped for was to make invasion so costly that America might accept something less than unconditional surrender. But even that was a fantasy. The Kamikaze campaign did not even come close to inflicting casualties on a scale that would change American strategic calculations. The irony becomes almost unbearable when you examine the economics of the Kamikaze strategy. The original concept had framed this as an efficient trade, sacrificing one cheap, expendable aircraft in exchange for sinking one expensive enemy warship. But this calculation fell apart when examined carefully. Planes were not actually cheap for Japan by 1945. The country's manufacturing capacity had been severely degraded by American bombing. Factories had been destroyed, workers killed, supply chains disrupted. Every aircraft that rolled off the production line represented precious materials and labour that Japan could barely spare. Then there was the fuel required for training flights, however minimal, and for the actual mission. Japan was running on fumes by this point in the war, with petroleum supplies nearly exhausted. The fuel used by thousands of kamikaze missions was fuel that could not be used for defending Japanese airspace from American bombers or supporting ground troops. There was also the cost of the pilot himself, the resources invested in whatever training he had received, the food and housing provided to him, the uniform and equipment issued. When you add it all up, each kamikaze mission actually cost Japan far more in resources than the average amount of damage inflicted on the enemy. The divine wind had become an economic disaster as well as a human one. As the war dragged toward its inevitable conclusion, American sailors' attitudes toward kamikaze attacks evolved in interesting ways. In the beginning, when these suicide tactics were new, there had certainly been fear. The idea of an enemy so fanatical that they would deliberately crash their planes into you was psychologically disturbing. It seemed to violate some unspoken rule of warfare, that both sides would at least try to survive. The early attacks had caught some ships off guard and inflicted real damage, creating anxiety among the crews. But as months passed and kamikazes became routine, as American defences improved and shooting down suicide attacks became almost mechanical, the terror faded. By the war's end, sailors no longer viewed kamikazes as an unstoppable force. Instead, the dominant emotion had shifted to something closer to pity mixed with contempt. They saw the kamikaze pilots as tragic figures, brave perhaps in their willingness to die, but also wasteful, futile, and ultimately ineffective. One American admiral captured this perfectly in a statement made after the war. He said that American sailors respected the courage it took to fly a kamikaze mission, but they pitied the futility of it. The attacks had failed, they had not changed anything. They had been a waste of life on a massive scale that achieved no meaningful results. When we step back and look at the entire kamikaze campaign with clear eyes, free from propaganda and mythology, the truth becomes inescapable. Kamikaze attacks did not change the course of the war. They did not force any changes to American strategy. They did not stop the American fleets from sailing wherever they wanted in the Pacific. They did not protect Japan's remaining island possessions. They did not prevent American submarines from strangling Japan's maritime trade. They did not prevent American bombers from burning Japanese cities. They did not alter the outcome of the war in any way. The vast majority of missions ended in complete failure, not because the pilots lacked courage or determination, but because courage and determination are not sufficient when you are facing an enemy with overwhelming material advantages, superior technology, better training, and more effective tactics. Personal bravery cannot overcome radar that detects you before you get anywhere close. Willingness to die does not help when American fighter pilots in faster, more maneuverable planes shoot you down before you reach the fleet. Determination does not let you penetrate a wall of anti-aircraft fire so dense that the sky itself seems to be exploding. The popular image perpetuated by Hollywood films shows kamikazes as flaming arrows of doom screaming down from the sky, while helpless American sailors watch in terror, unable to prevent the inevitable impact. This image bears almost no relationship to reality. The actual reality was far sadder and more pathetic. It was boys turned into human bombs, given inadequate training and obsolete equipment, sent against a fleet that they had no realistic chance of defeating. It was thousands of young men dying alone in the empty Pacific, shot down far from their targets, their sacrifices unwitnessed and meaningless. It was a desperate, bankrupt strategy adopted by a nation that had already lost but refused to admit it, willing to consume its own youth in a futile gesture. It was not divine wind. It was tragedy carried on wings, a waste of life that achieved nothing but grief. That is the real story of the kamikaze, stripped of mythology and propaganda. Not heroic, not effective, not successful, but simply tragic.